All right, Mark chapter 2 is where we are at. I'll read that text in just a moment. Again, we seek to just preach the Bible here at City Church, what's often called expositional preaching, which means to expose what's in the text and to let you hear the truth from God's Word each week. These are some things that have something in common, okay? I'll mention them. You may or may not recognize them. Mecca, the Dome of the Rock, the Western Wall, the Shrine of Valhalla, the Kashi, this is a hard one, Vishwanath Temple, it's a Hindu temple, the ISE Grand Shrine, the Mahabodhi Temple, Bryant Denny Stadium, these are all sacred places of world religions. Not sure where that last one fits in, but it's a world religion. If Alabama's your world, it's a world religion. Sacred places. Most of the world's major religions, they venerate some sacred space or place. Judaism considered Jerusalem, and specifically the temple, as sacred spaces, sacred places. But they venerated something beyond a physical space also as holy. They considered time sacred. Not just a space, but time sacred, specifically the Sabbath day, which is why the events in today's text are so controversial. Let's pick up in chapter 2, verse 23 is where we left off. One Sabbath, so here we are on a Sabbath day, he, this is Jesus of course, was going through the grain fields. And as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him, how he entered into the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat. And he also gave it to those who were with him. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Verse 1 of chapter 3. Again, he entered the synagogue, and again, this would have been on a Sabbath day. And a man was there with a withered hand. And they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come here." And he said to them, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. And he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately, there's our trigger word in Mark, immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. It's difficult for us to comprehend the importance of Sabbath in Judaism. There were two observances that distinguish the Jews from all other nations. Circumcision and Sabbath observance. Both of these observances were considered by the Jewish people badges of identity. They were matters of national pride. To not have your male child circumcised or to not observe Sabbath was turning your back on your own people in many ways. They held both of these things with deep, deep regard. And again, just these badges of identity, like who we are and their claim to fame. The observance of Sabbath, which happened from sunset Friday to sunset Saturday, was rooted in creation itself, when after 6 days of creation, God rested, the scriptures say. Not because God gets tired, but because God created us to live life within a work-rest rhythm. That Sabbath is built into God's creative design. When you kind of drill down into even the Old Testament ideas of Sabbath, you realize that not only were God's people instructed to rest, but also that God created into the rhythm of the creative design even the land to rest and the crops and the harvesting. Sabbath was a part of the essence of who they are and how they were to live the rhythm of life. We read the fourth and longest command earlier in the service, and it instructs the Israelites to remember the Sabbath. Remember the Sabbath, to set apart a sacred day. Specifically, they were directed to work for 6 days to sustain themselves and their families, and then to set aside 1 day for rest and enjoyment and replenishment. Very important. From the beginning, Sabbath observation was for the benefit and the well-being of God's people. It was not to be viewed as a burden, but a blessing. It was a rhythmic reminder of God's creative purpose for them, creative design for them, that they were work-rest creatures. But by the time that Jesus arrives on the scene, what God intended to be life-giving had been turned into restrictive rules. The focus became on what God's people could not do on that day. It became very obligation-focused and not a delight. I mean, the instructions in the Torah are very simple. We read them. Remember the Sabbath. I think it's interesting that we are instructed to remember. That implies that we are prone to forget God's rhythmic design, that we have to be intentional to remember Sabbath. And what we are to remember is that instead of working 7 days a week, set aside a day for rest and enjoyment. Now that is a simple enough command, it seems like, but here is the natural progression of religion, then and now. Remember the Sabbath is not enough for the religious. We have to define that. We have to define work. Well, what is work? If God said do not work, what is work? What qualifies as work? Now, back up. God simply instructs His people to practice Sabbath because it's not about what you are not doing, which is work, but it is about what you are doing, which is resting. And when Jesus walked the earth, the Mishnah, I've mentioned that a couple of times, the Mishnah were the kind of the oral traditions, the religious rule book that was created to supplement the law, right? So again, the Torah, God's law, was not enough, and so we have to supplement it. We have to add things so that we can spell out what does it mean to work. And so that's what happened. That's the progression that religion naturally takes. And so by the time Jesus arrives, the Mishnah lists 39 classes of work that were forbidden on the Sabbath. And not just the 39, but within those 39, there were hundreds of subcategories of things that were not allowed on Sabbath. Here's the mindset. We can't leave anything to chance. Like, we better specify what God means by work. And so if you kind of research into what were some of the prohibitions for Sabbath, some of them make sense. Some of the bans are things that we would expect. You should not go out and plow your field. And some of you are like, oh my. One of them was like, you can't go hunting on Sabbath. Slow down. It's okay. Can't go hunting. You can't butcher an animal. These are things that were forbidden on Sabbath. Construction was not allowed on Sabbath. These are things that seem to make sense to us. Like we can see why that would be a part. But the rules became so stringent that they included other things. Let me mention some of them. You cannot tie or loose a knot. You cannot sew more than one stitch. You cannot write more than one letter at a time. Like not just a letter, but a single letter, like A, B, C. You cannot add fresh water to a vase of cut flowers. You know why? Because that's considered sowing. You are doing an activity that would cause the plant to grow. So it was considered sowing. No sowing is allowed on Sabbath. You cannot separate good fruit from spoiled fruit, because that's considered winnowing or selecting or sifting, which was forbidden on Sabbath. Again, 39 categories with hundreds of subcategories. You cannot clean dried mud from your boots or clothes, because this would be considered grinding, which was a category that was forbidden. You cannot cut your hair or nails, because this is shearing. You cannot apply makeup. Guys? That would be considered dyeing. You cannot braid your hair. That was considered weaving. You cannot draw blood for a blood test. That fits in the slaughtering category. You cannot rub soap together to make lather. Can't apply face cream. Polish your shoes. Use a scouring powder for utensils or other surfaces. Cannot sharpen a pencil or paint or draw or type or tear through the lettering on a package or, ready for it, open an umbrella. Building, constructing. You cannot wear eyeglasses. These are things that became considered against Sabbath rules. Now, before we are really quick to roll our eyes and say, what in the world? Did you know we all have our own rules and regulations that we have put in place? They look different, but are equally absurd at times. Sabbath observance became more and more about the rules, the do's and the don'ts. And it became less and less about its original design, and eventually its intended purpose was completely lost. So with that context in mind of what Sabbath had become, let's revisit these episodes to kind of put into context what Jesus was dealing with. And so again, we back up to verse 23 of chapter 2. One Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. Throughout all of Mark's gospel, Jesus has been on the move. He's on the move here. They're going through the grain fields. The disciples are hungry, and so they began to pick heads of grain from a field. By the way, they're not stealing. This was permissible in that day. If you were hungry and traveling, it was permissible for you to gather some grains of wheat in someone's field or any type of grain to be able to eat and replenish yourself. And so that's what's going on. And then the religious police are on the prowl. Verse 24. And the Pharisees were saying to him, this time they're going right after Jesus. They have talked to the crowd in the past. They've talked to the disciples. Now they're going point blank to Jesus. The Pharisees were saying to him, look, why are they doing what is not lawful, what is not allowed on the Sabbath? Again, the religious nitpickers are saying, Jesus, this is not lawful. There's at least two violations going on here. One, a traveling violation. The prohibition was that you could not walk more than half a mile. More than half a mile was considered a journey. So you were not allowed to walk more than half a mile on Sabbath. Some of you are like, I'm all about that one. But the one that they really drill down on is this idea of reaping. You are not allowed to reap, right? Sow and reap on Sabbath day. And they are plucking heads of grain. Now, important again, neither of these are prohibitions that are forbidden by God's Sabbath instruction. Both of these are things that have been declared unlawful in this supplemental rule book that we call the Mishnah. These are the added rules. These were not God's rules. These were not God's intention. These were things that were added in the name of religion. How does Jesus respond? Verse 25. And he said to them, have you never read what David did? Always like how Jesus has these jabs at the religious elite. I mean, again, these guys were Old Testament scholars. And Jesus says, have you not read? Well, of course they've read. Have you never read what David did when he was in need? Don't miss this. He was in need and he was hungry, he and those who were with him. Now he entered into the house of God in the time of Abiathar the priest, and he ate the bread of the presence, which was not lawful for anyone but the priest to eat. And he also gave it to those who were with him. Jesus responds by replaying this episode in the life of David to illustrate how the Pharisees, the religious elite, have missed the heart of God in their application of God's word. This story is from 1 Samuel chapter 21. It recalls an episode where David and his men are literally, they're on the run from Saul, and they find themselves famished to the point of extreme weariness. And so they enter into the tabernacle and they eat the 12 loaves of bread that were a part of the process of the tabernacle, the structure of the tabernacle. Within the tabernacle, there was a place that was set up where there was 12 loaves of bread that were kept warm. It was a symbolic thing on the altar, and at the end of the week, they were given to the priest. Well, David and his men are hungry, and so they go in and they eat the 12 loaves of bread, which is called the showbread. So by utilizing this story, Jesus is doing a couple of things. One, Jesus is making a comparison between himself and David. Now, David is Israel's just messianic king prototype. So for Jesus to identify himself with David, right, was making a statement to the Pharisees. So not only is he identifying himself, comparing himself with David, the ultimate king in Israel's kind of economy of how things work, but he was also emphasizing how desperate human need, the men that were in need, desperate human need surpasses, it trumps meticulous observance of the law. It comes down to the difference in how Jesus views the purpose of the law and how the Pharisees observe the purpose of the law. For Jesus, the law was intended for Israel's flourishing, to provide wisdom on how to love God, how to love each other in everyday life. Its purposes were not to restrict life, but to enable God's people to live a full and whole life. So when you read like the Old Testament law and you're like, well, that's kind of weird. Why would they prohibit that? And why is that off limits? All of that, we tend to look at it through this negative lens. The reality is the law, Paul says, was like this kind of schoolmaster that was pointing us to what it means to live a whole and full life within God's design. Sabbath was a part of that. That's how Jesus viewed the law, positively. For the Pharisees, the law was a means to establish kind of their righteousness and holiness. And observance was an external mark of purity and morality. And it was used to judge other people and to sway God's favor. And here was their line of thinking. And why there was 39 categories and hundreds of subcategories. Because their line of thinking was the more details, the better. Because details surpass the purpose of the law. And so what eventually happened is the details, the rules, the regulations, the guidelines surpassed the law itself. That suddenly it became about all of these human-created rules and regulations and laws and do's and don'ts, and here's what it means and what it doesn't mean. Here's what a righteous person looks like, an unrighteous person. Here's what it means to be holy and unholy. And soon it became all about this, and God's purpose for the law was nullified. It was done away with. Two entirely different perspectives of the law. Now, as a result of this, the law became a burden. It became a means of manipulating, judging people, who was in, who was out. Righteousness and purity and morality and holiness became measured by external behavior and this human-created code of ethics. Now, this is so noteworthy. Don't miss this. Because here's our tendency. Our tendency living now is to read these stories, and we read about the Pharisees, and we have this kind of like, the Pharisees were really bad people. mindset. The Pharisees were bad, and in all of our children's books, there's kind of this image of the Pharisees as like these evil, notorious people. And the reality is this. The Pharisees in their day and age would have been the most respected and honored and considered the most religious people. They would have been looked at with favor. They would have been regarded as telling your children like that's a person to emulate. Like we have made them bad in our context. But in their context, they would have been the exact opposite. They would have been respected and honored and considered righteous and holy, Old Testament scholars. They created these rules for the purpose, the beginning purpose, to adhere to God's law. We want to be faithful to God's law, so here's what we need to do and not do. The problem became what we need to do and not do became as important as the law itself. And so Jesus comes on the scene and he dismantles the entire system. He upends the entire system because God's redemptive purpose was never about the rules. God's intended purpose was what it means to live freely under his rule and reign. Like public service announcement right now, we still tend to make it about the rules. Our hearts are still drawn in that direction. Like any recovering Pharisees out there with me on this? Like I am one. I'm a recovering Pharisee that has this battle in my life constantly. To make it about the external, the rules, the regulations, the things that I can measure and see and determine who's in and who's out and who's righteous and unrighteous based on my list. Look at the purpose of the Sabbath. This is why Jesus brings this back to verse 27. He said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Jesus is saying the Sabbath is a gift from God to enjoy. But it has been turned into something that did not feel like a gift. It felt like a burden. The people were serving the Sabbath rather than being served by the Sabbath. It's not about the plucking of the grain. It's about the nourishing of the famished, is what Jesus is saying. And then Jesus makes this bold statement and establishes himself as the authority on what Sabbath looks like under God's rule and reign. Jesus is saying, you're talking to the Lord of the Sabbath. You're talking, right, to the authority of what it means to observe Sabbath under God's rule and reign. And part of what kingdom living looks like is bringing Sabbath back to its original intention, which is a time that is set aside for rest and replenishment. It's a gift to God's people. Episode 2, verse 1, chapter 3. Again, he enters the synagogue. A man was there with a withered hand. This idea of a withered hand. And so within the rules of the Sabbath, the subcategories of the Sabbath, again, human-created rules and regulations. If a person had something that was a non-life-threatening injury, disease, whatever, any type of help was not to be performed on Sabbath. There's even crazy regulations in some of the first century writings that if a building fell and you're digging through to see if anybody died, if there's someone that's alive but their injury is not life-threatening, leave them till the next day. Like this is how far it had gone. A withered hand is not a life-threatening injury. And so they would have allowed this to continue. This can wait for another day. But that's not Jesus, who is Lord of the Sabbath. Verse 2, and they watched Jesus, check out the irony of this. They watched Jesus to see whether he would heal on the Sabbath so that they might accuse him. The Pharisees are watching Jesus with this malicious intent. They have evil intentions to watch Jesus on the Sabbath. Why? Because they're more concerned about the rules. Let me put it this way. They're more concerned about the issue than they are about the disabled man. He is a pawn to them. He's a test case. How's Jesus going to respond? Well, I love how Jesus responds. In a synagogue in that day, and there would have been benches around the outside of the room, and the teacher, the rabbi, would have stood in the middle and taught. to the benches, Jesus calls this man out of the bleachers and into the center. He said to the man with the withered hand, "Come here." Jesus brings the man front and center, not to be used as a pawn and as a test case. Jesus brings him front and center for redemptive, healing, wholesome purposes, right? Come here. Here's good news for us. Jesus does not use people like a pawn. Jesus does not take advantage. His purposes are redemption and restoration to make life whole. His purposes are flourishing. That's why when we gather together, right, doesn't look like synagogue life like it did in the first century, but it's still this gathering of God's people that we are to be a place for the broken and the bruised and the beat down. We are to be a place for people with withered hands and, listen, withered souls. It's okay to hurt and be here. It's okay to have a wounded heart and be here. It's okay to not have it all together. It's okay to be sick, right? It's okay to be disabled. It's okay to be struggling. That Jesus calls us together to gather for a wholesome, redemptive, healing purposes. Come here, Jesus says. Come here. Come here. Verse 4, I love this softball pitch that Jesus gives them. He said to them, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. Well, of course they were. I mean, how are you going to answer that question? Jesus just lobs this softball in their direction, right? And it reveals their hearts. All right, you tell me, what should I do on the Sabbath? Good or bad? Death or life? Rules or people? And they are quiet. And then look at Jesus' response. We talked about this some in our small groups a couple of weeks ago. And he looked around at them with anger. Here's a word that we always don't want to associate with Jesus, right? Anger. But over and over again in the New Testament, we find this image of Jesus that because he is so full of compassion toward the broken and the hurting, that he also is at times filled with righteous and holy anger toward those who either cause it or allow it. And this is an instance of that. That Jesus is filled with anger at them, grieved at their hardness of hearts. And he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He doesn't even touch the man in this instance. And he stretches it out, and his hand was restored. Jesus expresses this righteous anger and grief over their stubborn opposition to God's redemptive purposes in the name of religion, of all things. The disabled man does the opposite of the religious Pharisees. He comes out. He exposes himself and his vulnerability to Jesus. And as a result, he's healed. He's made whole. He's redeemed. Their response. The Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. We saw at the beginning of the section, at the beginning of chapter 2, they're murmuring, they're complaining, they're talking like, who is this guy? Who has the authority to forgive sins? All these things. By the end of this section, we got to annihilate this guy. We have to destroy him. They plot, check this out, the Pharisees plot to kill Jesus with the Herodians. You know who the Herodians were? The Herodians were pro-Rome supporters of Herod. The opposite of the Pharisees in every way. They were a political group. So here are the Jewish religious elite joining forces with the pro-Rome political opposition. The Pharisees believed that God's kingdom was coming to earth to annihilate the Romans, to establish them as the rulers of the world. And now they're joining hearts and hands with pro-Rome political party for one purpose, to kill Jesus. I mean, the answer to Jesus' question that he asked earlier, do harm, do good, life, death, the answer to Jesus' question is answered by their actions, isn't it? Jesus brings life and healing, and they plot to destroy and kill, by the way, on the Sabbath. Jesus does good, and they conspire to do evil. So check it out. By the end of this section, Jesus has developed a reputation among the religious as a blasphemer, as a friend of sinners and tax collectors, as a violator of religious customs, and now as a Sabbath breaker. That's Jesus' reputation in this one section. And they want him dead. They want him gone. And that's how the story of Jesus will play out from this time forward. So I want to end this section of Mark's gospel. We'll start a new section next week, verse 7 of chapter 3. But I'll end this section with, for us, with a warning and an encouragement, okay? So the warning is this. The warning is, it is easy for our religion to become about things that can be measured and observed and fulfilling certain requirements or abiding by a set of rules that our circle of influence has created on what it means to be holy or pure or moral. It's easy for our religion to become that. The sphere of influence around us in which we were raised, or the circle that we run in, or our spiritual influences, is easy for the rules, regulation, good, bad, righteous, unrighteous, holy, unholy criteria of that circle to become how we measure spirituality. I grew up in these circles. Like I said, still a recovering Pharisee. Still struggle in these areas of my life. It is easy for religion to develop a fondness for negativity, to be focused on what cannot be done instead of God's life-giving intentions. It is easy for religion to become, listen, this is so applicable for 2022. It is easy for our religion to become more issue-focused than people-focused. You hear me? It's easy for us to voice all the issues that we are against, all the things we stand against, and to become an issue-focused group instead of a people-focused group. Remember when Jesus was asked, what is the greatest command? How did Jesus respond? It's to love God with everything that you are. And love what? Love people. Love God. Love people. Did Jesus have access to the Mishnah? Did Jesus have access to the Torah? Yes. Did Jesus pull a scroll out of his pocket and like, all right, you want to know the greatest commands? Here's our list. Here's the 20 do's and the 12 don'ts, or here's the 42 things you're not allowed to do on Sabbath. Jesus never a single time mentions an issue. What he does say is love God with everything you are. Love God and love people. Love, right, your neighbor as yourself. These are the greatest commands. As a matter of fact, Jesus says every other command hinges on these. Loving God and loving people. He does not mention a single issue. You know what else he says in another gospel? You can be persuaded you are completely right on all the issues and nullify your beliefs by not loving your neighbor as God intends. Jesus says you can have it all nailed down. Every issue, every right, this is what it looks like. But do away with all of it because you don't treat people right. You can nullify, that's a scary phrase. You can nullify God's word based on how you love others. But Devin, my intentions are good. We love to justify this issue with our intentions. I don't want to break this law or this command, so I'm going to put all these rules in place to keep me from doing that. My intentions are good. Did you know Jesus went after intentions all the time? It's not about the right intentions. We can't use intentions to justify this. The Pharisees had awesome intentions. We're going to create all these rules to keep us from breaking the law. We're going to do these. Here's the 39 classes. Here's the hundreds of subcategories that will keep you from violating the Sabbath. And Jesus comes and dismantles the whole thing. Their intentions were pure and right and holy in regard of trying to obey God's law. And yet Jesus demonstrates and teaches God's kingdom is oriented toward goodness, toward healing, toward life, toward restoration. And as citizens of His kingdom, our posture should not be one of avoidance and negativity, but flourishment and wholeness and goodness. Now, let's speak clear here. Certainly, Scripture includes prohibitions. But these directives are not intended to be restrictive or limited or burdensome. Instead, they illustrate what it means to live life in a way that displays God's grace and His good rule and reign in our lives. What it means to enjoy the life-giving presence of the Holy Spirit in our lives. What it means to live life in community with each other. What it means to love our neighbors, to love each other through the ups and downs, goods and the hills and valleys. Obedience in the Scriptures is never about sitting upright and feeling uptight. You ever feel that way? Obedience is measured by, am I sitting upright, am I feeling uptight, and this kind of begrudgingly follow along list of rules and regulations. Obedience is about living a life that is defined by His goodness, by His grace, that compels us toward wholesome and fruitful living. It is a response to His goodness in my life, a response to His grace in my life. A response to the gospel in life that has set me free, not to live under the tyranny of sin, but to enjoy the goodness and wholeness of God. You guys hear me say it regularly at City Church. Unrighteous and self-righteous living are both equally destructive to the soul. And if you're like me, I must constantly preach the gospel to my inner Pharisee. Constantly. Reminding my inner Pharisee, am I loving God? Am I loving my neighbors? It's less about issues, more about people. The gospel redeems people right where they are. You see, it is easy to miss the heart of God and make it about the rules and regulations, which is important when it comes to matters like Sabbath. And here's where I want to encourage us, all right? So warning, now encouragement. Here's the encouragement. Recapture this idea of Sabbath in your life. So Paul in Romans 14 and Colossians 2, he informs us non-Jewish Jesus followers that we are free. We're free to choose how we will practice Sabbath. Our weekly calendars may not line up with the Jewish practice of Sabbath, which was Friday sunset to Saturday sunset, which is not a bad practice. Our calendars may not line up with that kind of Jewish established calendar of that day, but here's what is important. Remember Sabbath. Remember Sabbath. You see, Sabbath is designed by our Creator to keep our lives attuned to the rhythm of His creative order, purpose, and design. Sabbath is for our well-being. It is for our nourishment. And we must be wise in how we live out the work-rest rhythm in our lives. Sabbath is not just a day off where we do other work, right? It's not just a day off where we do work that's off the clock. It is a gift. It is a gift designed to remind us of who we are and whose we are. It is a gift to remind us who we are not. It reminds us, listen, the world doesn't revolve around me. The world keeps going without me. It reminds us of our place in God's created world. You're not the center of the universe. He is. And Sabbath forces us to step out of the chaos and recenter our hearts and lives around who He is and who we are in Him. Sabbath requires trust. Do I really believe that God's creative design is best for me? That's the question about Sabbath. Do I really trust that the way God created this work, rest, rhythm of life, do I really believe that is God's best for me? Or am I just going to kind of do my own thing because I got a lot going on and, it's busy and there's more overtime. Let's just take that vacation and, whose design is really best? Is it my design or is it God's? Is it, let's be honest, my employer's or is it God's? Trust. Well, I intentionally set aside time, in this case, a day, let's all gasp together, a day to stop, rest, worship, enjoy, recharge, replenish. Here's the umbrella term. Remember who I am and who He is. And how applicable is this to our day and age? That every single day of my life, I am tempted to live under the tyranny of things, stuff, to-do list, busyness, schedules, hurry, hustle, excess, social media, technology, non-stop activities, a phone in my pocket that is accessible every minute of every day, and on and on and on and on. Every single day, I am tempted to live under the control and the tyranny of stuff, of things. And the question for us that follow Jesus is, if I am not intentional to remember the Sabbath, to set aside a specific day, to step out of the chaos, to recenter my heart and soul, to reconnect with the Creator and His creation, then the rhythm of my soul will be disrupted, right? Just not how God created and wired me. The center, the rhythm of my soul will be disrupted, and eventually it will decay because I am disconnected from the Creator. Connection with the Creator takes intentional time, doesn't it? To stop, to pause, to step out of the chaos, to look around me, to look beyond a 4-inch screen in my hand and to see what God has done, what He is doing. Intentional, recapturing Sabbath. I don't know what Sabbath looks like for you. To be honest, I'm still trying to figure out what it looks like for us. This is not been a Sabbath-friendly season. It's been the opposite of that. It's been a crazy, chaotic, what are we going to get done season. I don't know what it even looks like for us. We figure that out, we talk, we put practices into place, and then we have every excuse to violate them. So I don't know what Sabbath looks like for you. But here's what I do know. God initiated Sabbath as a gift for his creatures to observe, to enjoy, to celebrate. So, let's be real. Turn off the phone. Step out of the noise. Put down the to-do list. Learn to say no. And set aside time. In God's design, 24 hours a week. Set aside time to rest, trust, and most importantly, remember who you are and remember who you are not. And what we're doing in that moment is prioritizing our Creator and learning to enjoy his creation. As I said to you guys the last couple of weeks, be intentional to celebrate the gifts that God has given us. Take your Sabbath, eat good food, have friends over, laugh, do the things that enjoy and recharge your batteries. I don't know what it looks like for you, but I know it involves prioritizing our Creator, enjoying the gifts of his creation. God established Sabbath for your good. Now go enjoy it. P.S. Don't let the Pharisees tell you what that looks like.